I remember the first time I tasted my own blood. In the training halls of Korriban. It was during the third week of foundational trials, and the copper tang mixed with the dust that seemed to coat everything in that forsaken place. The air itself felt heavy there, not just with heat or the weight of the desert wind, but with something older, something that pressed against your chest when you tried to sleep. We were told it was the dark side, that we should learn to breathe it in like sustenance. But in those early days, it just felt like drowning in sand while standing perfectly still. They never told us our arrival would be the last moment of mercy we would ever know. I had come to the academy with purpose, or at least what I believed was purpose at the time. My family had been minor nobles on Dromund Kaas, court functionaries who processed agricultural requisitions and maintained loyalty records for our sector, comfortable enough to know the taste of real food, lowly enough to understand we were always 3 mistakes away from disappearing into the labor colonies beneath the capital. My father had served the Empire faithfully for 37 years. My mother taught me to read High Sith before I could write my own name. They raised me to believe that service was the highest calling, that the strong deserved to rule, and that the Sith Order represented the ultimate expression of strength made manifest. When the talent scouts identified my force sensitivity during a routine blood screening, my parents wept with what I thought was joy. I understand now that they were mourning. The transport that carried us to Korriban was a converted cattle hauler, stripped of any comfort or accommodation beyond the bare minimum required to keep us alive for the journey. There were 43 of us in that hold. Why? I remember the number because I counted them obsessively during those 6 days of travel, my mind clinging to anything concrete as the reality of my new existence began to settle over me like funeral shroud. We came from across the Empire young, humans, Zabraks, purebloods, even 2 Twi'leks, whose head tails had been branded with ownership marks that their former masters had applied before selling them to the Academy's procurement officers. We did not speak much during that journey. Some of us tried in those first hours to forge connections or establish hierarchies, but the crew made it clear that such behaviors were premature. Every 12 hours, they would drag one of us from the hold at random and return them 4 hours later, beaten severely enough that speech was impossible, but carefully enough that nothing was permanently broken. It was our first lesson, though we did not recognize it as such. Anticipation of pain is its own form of torture, and randomness makes resistance impossible. By the time we descended through Korriban's atmosphere, we had learned to sit in silence and wait. The academy itself rose from the red sand like a wound in the desert, all dark stone and sharp angles, built into the side of a mountain that the ancient Sith had hollowed out over millennia. The architecture was deliberately hostile, too many stairs, corridors that narrowed without warning, ceilings that pressed down until you felt the weight of all that stone threatening to crush you. Everything was the color of dried blood, from the sand to the rock to the metal fixtures that had rusted in the arid air. Even the sunlight looked wrong, filtered through a haze of dust that turned the sky the color of a fresh bruise. We were lined up in the main courtyard, still in our civilian clothes, still carrying the scents of our former lives, perfume, machine oil, cooking spices, home. Around us, other acolytes moved between buildings in dark robes, their faces hidden in shadow, and the only sound beyond our own breathing was the constant whisper of wind through the valley and the distant hum of the Academy's power generators, buried somewhere deep in the mountain's roots. That hum became the rhythm of my nightmares. Even now, decades later, I cannot escape it. An overseer emerged from the main entrance, a human woman whose face bore the geometric scars of dark Jedi ritual scarification. She walked slowly down our line, examining each of us the way a farmer might examine livestock at auction, professionally disinterested, evaluating only utility and durability. When she reached me, she stopped. She was close enough that I could smell the chemical scent of whatever preservative they used on those robes, close enough that I could see my own reflection, distorted in her eyes, which had been surgically altered to appear entirely black. "You?" she said, her voice surprisingly soft, almost maternal. "You still think this is an honor?" I said nothing. We had been warned not to speak unless commanded to do so. She smiled, and it was the most terrible thing I had seen up to that point in my young life. Good. The ones who arrive, afraid, learn nothing useful. But the ones who arrive proud. She leaned closer, and I could feel the heat radiating from her, as if something burned constantly beneath her skin. You will teach the others what ambition costs. Yee. Then she moved on, and I was left standing there with those words burrowing into my mind like parasites. They took our clothes that first day. Took our names too, though that came later. First, we were stripped in the courtyard, all 43 of us standing naked in the wind while servants slaves actually, though we would not learn to recognize the distinction for some time off, gathered our belongings into piles that were loaded onto carts and hauled away. My mother's pendant, a small thing of carved stone that she had pressed into my palm before I boarded the transport, disappeared into a bag with 24 other trinkets. I watched it go and felt something inside me go with it. Some last connection to the person I had been. We were issued our robes then, rough spun fabric that chafed against skin, unused to such coarse material. No undergarments, no padding, nothing between our bodies and that abrasive cloth. This too was deliberate. We would learn later that discomfort was a tool, that the low-grade suffering of constant irritation was part of how they kept us always slightly off balance, never quite able to settle into any state of peace or equilibrium. The robes were identical, dark gray, not yet the black of a full acolyte, and they fit no one properly. Too long in the sleeves for some, too short in the hem for others. We looked like children playing dress-up in adult clothes, and perhaps that was the point, to remind us that we were nothing yet, that we had to grow into the identity being forced upon us. They marched us into the academy proper then, through corridors that seemed to turn back on themselves, past chambers where we glimpsed other acolytes engaged in activities we could not yet identify, meditation perhaps, or torture, or both. The distinction would prove less clear than I expected. We descended into the mountain, level after level, until I lost all sense of how far down we had gone. The air grew cooler and drier, and the walls showed their age, ancient stonework marked with Sith script that none of us could read. Our dormitory was a long, narrow chamber carved directly from the rock, with sleeping pallets arranged in 2 rows along either wall. 43 pallets, numbered me. I was assigned number 17. The pallet was a thin mat over stone, with a single blanket that looked like it had been used by dozens of occupants before me. There were no lockers, no personal space, nowhere to put anything, even if we had been allowed to keep possessions. At one end of the chamber was a communal washroom, just a row of spigots and drains carved into the floor. At the other end was a sealed door that we were told led to the training halls. We would come to know that door very well. The overseer who had examined me in the courtyard, we learned her name was Overseer Kresh, stood at the center of the dormitory and addressed us for the first time as a group. Her voice echoed strangely in that chamber, seeming to come from everywhere at once. "You are not Sith," she said. "You are not even acolytes. You are less than slaves, because a slave has proven their ability to survive. You are potential. You are raw material. You are meat that might, if you prove worthy, be forged into something resembling a tool that the Empire can use." She paused, letting that sink in. "The mortality rate for your intake class is typically 75%. 3 out of every 4 of you will be dead, irreversibly crippled, or dismissed as failures before your 2nd year is complete. Some of you will die in training. Some will die in the trials. Some will die in the trials. Some will kill yourselves when you finally understand what you have become. And some up." She smiled again, that horrifying expression that suggested she could see futures that we could not. "Some of you will kill each other, because that is how the dark side teaches." A girl near the front of the group, Azabrak, I remember, with traditional facial tattoos that marked her as coming from one of the warrior clans, raised her hand, hesitantly. Overseer Kresh turned to her with the slow, predatory attention of a hunting cat, spotting movement. "Speak," Kresh commanded. "Overseer," the girl said, her voice steady despite the fear I could see in her posture. "If we are to become Sith, Shouldn't we be training with the Force? Learning the ancient techniques? Kresh walked toward her, slow steps that echoed in the silence. What is your name? Shira Vex. Overseer died. Tell me, Shira Vex, what do you know about pain? The girl hesitated. I've endured the traditional trials of my people. The scarification writes the No. Kresh cut her off with a gesture. You know nothing. Pain you chose, pain with purpose and ceremony and cultural meaning, teaches you only that you can endure what you agreed to endure. It teaches you nothing about breaking. Nothing about the moment when your will shatters against a force greater than yourself. She stopped directly in front of the girl. Now, the Force is not a tool you learn to use. It is not a skill you develop through study and practice. The Force is an ocean, and you are learning to drown in it so that one day, if you are strong enough, you might learn to breathe water instead of air. Whoa. Kresh raised her hand, and Shira Vex collapsed, screaming. I had never heard a sound like that before. It was not the scream of injury or fear, but something deeper, more primal. The sound of a nervous system being played like an instrument, every pain receptor firing simultaneously. The girl convulsed on the stone floor, her body arching impossibly, her hands clawing at her own face. The screaming went on for what felt like hours, but was probably less than 30 seconds, and then it stopped as abruptly as it had begun. Shira Vex lay on the cold stone, breathing in shallow gasps, her eyes rolled back in her head. That, Overseer Kresh said calmly, was nothing, a fraction of what the dark side can inflict. But it is the first thing you must learn. Pain is not your enemy. Pain is your teacher, your constant companion. And eventually, if you survive long enough, your weapon. She turned to address all of us again. Now, we do not train you to use the Force. We break you down until the Force can flow through the cracks we create. We destroy who you were so that something stronger might emerge from the ruins. She gestured, and 2 servants entered the dormitory, dragging Shira Vex away. The girl was still breathing but did not resist, her limbs hanging loose like a puppet with cut strings. Sleep now, Kresh said. Tomorrow, your education begins. The door sealed behind her, and we were alone. No one spoke for a long time. We moved to our assigned pallets like automatons, each of us processing what we had just witnessed. I lay down on my thin mat and pulled the rough blanket over myself, but I did not close my eyes. None of us did at first. We lay there in the darkness. The chamber's glow lamps had dimmed to almost nothing, and listened to each other breathe, each of us alone with our thoughts and the growing certainty that we had made a terrible mistake, but there was no path back. The academy was not a school one could leave. We had been claimed by the dark side, and it would either forge us into its instruments or consume us in the attempt. I must have slept eventually, though I do not remember the transition. What I remember is waking to a sound like thunder, a percussive boom that shook dust from the ceiling and brought all 42 of Usashira. Vex had not returned, bolt upright on our pallets. The lights had come up to full brightness, harsh and white, and the sealed door at the end of the chamber was opening. Overseer Kresh stood in the doorway, but she was not alone. Behind her stood 3 figures in full Sith robes, their faces hidden beneath hoods, their presence in the Force like cold pressure against my skull. I had never been trained to sense the Force consciously, but in that moment, I did not need training. Their power was obvious, oppressive, undeniable. Kresh commanded. Whoa. Form a line. We scrambled to obey, our movements clumsy with sleep and fear. I found myself in the middle of the line, surrounded by strangers who 24 hours ago had been passengers in a cargo hold, and who now were my only companions in whatever was about to happen. They marched us back through the corridors, up now instead of down, through parts of the academy we had not yet seen. We passed chambers where older acolytes sparred with training sabers, their movements barely visible as they blurred through combat forms at superhuman speed. We passed meditation halls, where dozens of students sat in perfect silence, some of them bleeding from eyes or ears, the casualties of pushing their minds too hard against barriers they were not yet ready to break. We passed rooms filled with bodhisattva, whether sleeping, unconscious, or dead, I could not tell, arranged in neat rows on examination tables while robed figures moved between them, making notations on data pads. We climbed and climbed, and the air grew warmer, and finally we emerged onto a platform near the Academy's peak, an open-air courtyard where the red sun of Korriban beat down without mercy, and the wind carried sand that stung exposed skin like tiny needles. In the center of the courtyard was a circle, perhaps 20 meters in diameter, marked out in the stone with lines of what looked like molten metal that had been poured into carved channels. Around the circle stood equipment I did not recognize. Tall metal frames with cables and power conduits humming with the same low-frequency vibration as the generators deep in the mountain. "Today you learn the first principle," Overseer Kresh announced, her voice somehow audible over the wind. "Power requires sacrifice." She gestured, and the three hooded figures moved to positions around the circle, equidistant from each other, creating a triangle. "You will enter the circle one at a time. You will walk from one side to the other. The distance is 12 meters. Any child could walk it in seconds." She paused. "But you will not be children in there. You will be exposed to the dark side in its rawest form, channeled through the ancient wards carved into this stone, and amplified by the technology you see around you. The dark side will find every weakness in your mind, every fear, every shame, every secret horror you have ever imagined. It will make those things real for you, and you will walk through that reality to the other side." "No." One of the younger acolytes, a human boy who could not have been more than 14, raised his hand slightly. Kresh nodded at him. What happens if we can't make it across?" Kresh's expression did not change. "Then you die. Your heart will stop, or your brain will shut down, or you will simply fall and never rise. The dark side does not accept weakness. It will find the flaw in your spirit and widen it until you break." She gestured to the three hooded figures. "These are full Sith, graduates of this academy, each powerful enough to reduce you to ash with a thought. They are here to ensure that the dark side does not escape the circle and harm the other students. They are not here to save you." The boy who had asked the question looked like he might vomit. "We will go in the order you are standing," Kresh continued. "Number 1, step forward." The first acolyte, a pureblood woman whose red skin seemed to glow in the harsh sunlight, moved toward the circle with visible reluctance. She stopped at the edge, staring at the metal lines that marked the boundary, and I could see her shoulders shaking. "Enter," Kresh commanded. The woman stepped across the line, and everything changed. She took 2 more steps, then stopped, her whole body going rigid. Her mouth opened in a scream, but no sound emerged. Or if it did, the wind took it away. She stood frozen for perhaps 5 seconds, then began to move forward again. But her movements were raw, jerky, puppet-like, as if she were fighting against invisible restraints. 3 more steps. 4. She fell to her knees, her hands pressed against her temples, and I could see blood beginning to run from her nose, dark against her red skin. She did not get up. One of the hooded Sith gestured, and the woman's body lifted from the ground, floating through the air until it cleared the circle's boundary and deposited itself on the stone outside. Servants appeared from somewhere. I had not noticed them before, and dragged her away. She was still breathing, I saw that much, but her eyes were open and blank, seeing nothing. "Number 2, Kresh said, as if nothing significant had just occurred. The second acolyte was the human boy who had asked the question. He looked at Kresh, then at the circle, then back at Kresh. I can't. Please, Enter, Kresh repeated, her voice flat. The boy shook his head. backing away. No. I want to go home. I didn't know it would be like this, please, One of the Sith raised a hand, and the boy stopped mid-sentence, his body rigid. He began to walk forward against his will, his legs moving in stiff mechanical steps, his face twisted in terror as he fought against the invisible force compelling him. He crossed the boundary of the circle, still struggling, still trying to resist, and the moment he entered, he began to scream. This time we could hear it, high and piercing and endless. He managed 4 steps before he collapsed, convulsing, his body arcing and thrashing as if electricity were being poured directly into his nervous system. The screaming stopped when his jaw dislocated. He crawled another meter on his belly, leaving a trail of blood from where his fingers clawed at the stone, and then he went still. The Sith did not retrieve him. They let him lie there as number 3 approached the circle. This continued for hours. Some made it across None, perhaps 1 in every 5 or 6 attempts. Those who succeeded emerged shaking, bleeding from various orifices, often unable to walk without assistance, but they had survived. They were pulled aside and given water, and allowed to sit in the shade of the academy wall, while the rest of us waited our turn. Those who failed were either removed if they were still alive, or left in the circle as object lessons. By the time my turn came, number 17, there were 4 bodies lying in that circle, scattered across the 12 meters like abandoned dolls. 2 were clearly dead, their stillness absolute. The other 2 might have been alive, might have been unconscious, might have been aware but paralyzed. I could not tell, and was not given time to examine them closely. I stood at the edge of the circle, and looked across at the far side, 12 meters away, a distance I had walked thousands of times without thought. The bodies lay between me and that goal. The metal lines in the stone seemed to pulse with their own light, or perhaps that was my imagination. The 3 Sith watched from their positions, expressionless and patient. "Enter," Overseer Kresh commanded. I took a breath of the hot, sand-filled air, tasted dust and fear, and stepped across the boundary. The first step was manageable. I felt pressure, like diving too deep in water, but nothing I could not withstand. The second step was harder. The pressure increased, and with it came a sound, distant at first but growing louder, the sound of screaming, hundreds or thousands of voices all crying out in agony. The third step, and the screaming became specific, became my mother's voice calling my name, became my father begging for mercy, became every person I had ever known pleading with me to save them from torments I could not see, but could imagine vividly. Fourth step. The pressure was crushing now, and I could barely breathe. The bodies on the ground around me began to move, to writhe, to reach for me with hands that were broken and bleeding. I knew they were illusions. Some part of my mind remained rational enough to understand but they felt real. When one of them grabbed my ankle, I felt the cold grip of dead fingers, and I kicked frantically to break free. Fifth step. The air itself turned to fire. I could feel my skin blistering, could smell my own flesh cooking, and the pain was beyond anything I had experienced or imagined. I wanted to fall, to curl up and die and let the fire consume me and end the agony, but some stubborn core of my being refused to allow it. I had not come this far, had not abandoned everything I knew, to fail at the first test. Sixth step. Wall. The fire vanished, replaced by ice so cold it burned worse than flames. I could not feel my limbs. My heart was slowing, each beat taking an eternity, and I was certain the next beat would not come. The voices were screaming at me to give up, to accept failure, to admit that I was weak and unworthy, and that I had always been destined to die alone and forgotten in this terrible place. Seventh step. I fell to my knees, just as others had, and the stone was sharp against my skin. Blood, I realized, running from my nose and ears, and possibly my eyes pooled beneath me. I could not see clearly. Everything was red and black, and swirling with patterns that hurt to look at. The dark side was inside me now, crawling through my veins, examining every corner of my mind and finding every weakness, every secret, every moment of shame or doubt or fear. It showed me futures. Terrible futures. I saw myself as a Sith Lord, powerful and terrible, standing over the corpse of everyone I had ever loved. I saw myself broken and discarded, a failed acolyte thrown into the labor camps to dig ore until my hands bled and my lungs filled with dust. I saw the empire falling, the galaxy burning, trillions dead because of decisions I would make or fail to make. I saw myself alone in darkness, forever, conscious but unable to move or speak or die, trapped in my own mind for eternity. And beneath all of it, I heard laughter. Cold, ancient, merciless laughter that mocked my suffering and promised worse to come. 8th step. Thought 1. I was crawling now, unable to stand. My hands found purchase on the rough stone and pulled me forward, inch by inch. The bodies around me were not illusions anymore. Perhaps they had never been illusions, and I had simply lacked the sense to perceive them correctly. They whispered to me, warning me, telling me to turn back before I became like them, broken things left to rot in this circle of torment. 9th step. I vomited, though I had not eaten in nearly a day, and there was nothing to bring up but bile and blood. The taste of copper filled my mouth. I could not remember my name, could not remember why I was here, or what I was trying to achieve. All that remained was the forward motion, the next handful of stone, the next dragging movement of my legs. 10th step. Clarity returned suddenly, shockingly. The pain was still there. I was still bleeding, still burning or freezing or both. But my mind cleared. I understood in that moment what the trial was actually testing. Not strength. No. Not endurance. Not willpower. It was testing whether we could continue functioning even after we broke, whether we could move forward even when the part of us that defined identity and purpose had shattered into pieces. The dark side did not want the strong. It wanted the broken ones who refused to stay broken. I tried saw what news away of Dorier. 11th step. I raised my head and saw the boundary ahead, just one more meter, one more impossible distance. My vision was darkening at the edges. My heartbeat was irregular, stuttering. I was dying. I realized that clearly, my body shutting down from the trauma it had endured. But one more meter was humiliated. Just one more. I lunged forward, extending my arms, and my fingertips crossed the metal line. The pressure vanished instantly. The pain did not. That would linger for days. But the crushing weight of the dark side lifted, and I could breathe again. I lay there, half in the circle and half out, gasping like a landed fish, and felt hands grab me under the arms and drag me fully clear. I had made it. I had survived. But as I sat there in the shade, blood drying on my face, watching the remaining acolytes take their turns, I understood something that the ones who had given up or died had not lived long enough to learn. Survival was not victory. It was simply qualification for the next trial, and the next, and the next, an endless chain of suffering that would continue until we either ascended to true power or were destroyed in the attempt. Of the 42 who entered the circle that day, 17 crossed to the other side alive. 14 died, their bodies left where they fell until the trial was complete, then removed by servants and presumably disposed of in whatever way the Academy dealt with its failures. 11 were still alive, but had failed to complete the crossing. These were taken away on stretchers, and we never saw them again. That left 25 of us. They gave us water and an hour to rest, then marched us back down into the Academy. We did not return to our dormitory. Instead, they took us to a medical facility deep in the mountain, a place of harsh light and antiseptic smell, where robed figures, doctors or dark Jedi or something, in between each examined us with professional detachment. They treated our physical injuries, applying Bacta to burns and setting broken bones, and doing what was necessary to ensure we would not die from our injuries. But they did not treat us gently, and they did not offer comfort. We were resources that needed maintenance, nothing more. I learned during that examination that I had fractured 3 ribs, ruptured several blood vessels in my brain causing minor hemorrhaging, and damaged my kidneys severely enough that I would need regular medical monitoring for the rest of my life. All of this from 12 meters of walking. Yan Tiao Nur. After the medical examination, they tattooed us. All 25 who had survived received the same marka, small symbol in High Sith script, burned into the skin just above our hearts. I did not know then what it meant, but I would learn. It was the mark of the first trial, proof that we had been tested and found minimally worthy. Many acolytes we would discover never received even this. Finally, exhausted and hurting, we were allowed to return to the dormitory. The pallets of those who had died or failed had been removed, along with their numbers. The room felt emptier, colder. We collapsed onto our remaining pallets without speaking, each of us processing what we had endured. I lay there, feeling the throb of my fractured ribs with each breath, and knew that this was just the beginning. The Academy would test us again and again, finding new ways to break us, new limits to push us past. And we would either adapt or we would join the bodies I had crawled past in that circle. Sleep came eventually, but it brought no rest. My dreams were filled with screaming and fire and the cold laughter of the dark side. And when I woke to the sound of thunder announcing another day of training, I was not sure whether I had truly slept or simply lost consciousness for a few hours. The days that followed established the rhythm that would define my existence for the next 3 years. We woke before dawn to the sound of percussion charges detonated in the corridors outside our dormitory. We had 7 minutes to dress, relieve ourselves in the communal washroom, and form a line at the sealed door. Those who were late received punishment. At first, minor things like reduced meal rations or additional physical labor, but the punishments escalated quickly if the lateness became habitual. I saw one acolyte, a Twi'lek named Yovin, who simply could not master waking on time, eventually subjected to force lightning for 30 seconds as the rest of us watched. After that, he was never late again, though he developed a tremor in his hands that never completely went away. Our mornings were dedicated to physical conditioning. They marched us to training halls where we ran circuits until we vomited, performed calisthenics until our muscles failed, sparred against each other with training staves until we were covered in bruises. The overseers watched without expression, occasionally selecting one of us to receive additional attention, usually in the form of the subject being forced to continue an exercise well past the point of failure, their body controlled by the Force, and made to move even after conscious will had given out. I learned what it felt like to run until my heart was ready to burst, then be forced to run another kilometer while someone else puppeted my legs. I learned the specific quality of pain that comes from muscle tears, the sensation of ligaments pulling away from bone, the dizzy nausea of a concussion received during a sparring match that the overseers allowed to continue for another 10 minutes after I should have been pulled out. The Academy did not care about our health beyond basic survival. They pushed us to our limits, then past them, teaching us through direct experience that the body was a tool that could be driven harder than we thought possible. Some broke out, literally, bones snapping during exercises, hearts giving out during runs. These were removed, treated if the injury was survivable, and either returned to training once healed or dismissed from the academy entirely if the damage was too severe. Afternoons were for meditation and forced training, though these terms poorly described what actually occurred. We would be taken to meditation chambers, small, dark rooms where the walls were carved with Sith script that seemed to writhe in our peripheral vision, and commanded to sit in silence for hours. The overseers would monitor us through the Force, punishing any lapse in concentration with sharp pulses of pain directly into our minds. The goal, they told us, was to open ourselves to the dark side, to let it flow through us and begin the process of reshaping our connection to the Force. But opening oneself to the dark side was not like the serene meditation I had imagined before arriving at the academy. It was more like opening a wound and letting infection seep in. Meticulously, The dark side wanted things from Usa: anger, fear, hatred, suffering. It fed on these emotions and grew stronger in their presence. And as we learned to channel it, we learned simultaneously to cultivate the very feelings that sustained it. They taught us to hate, specifically, methodically, deliberately. Overseers would enter our meditation sessions and provoke us, insulting our families, our intelligence, our worth. They would strike us without warning, or use the force to create sensations of violation and helplessness. And they would demand that we channel our resulting anger not into resistance, but into the dark side, letting it amplify our fury until we could feel the force responding to our emotions. The first time I successfully moved an object with the force saw, a small training sphere, made to levitate when properly manipulated. It was because Overseer Kresh had spent 20 minutes describing in precise detail how my mother had likely been reassigned to a pleasure house after I left for the academy, how my father had probably been demoted and stripped of his position, how my family name was being used as an example of disgrace and failure throughout it. I hated her with a purity and intensity that felt like fire in my blood. And in that hatred, I felt the force respond. The sphere rose from its pedestal, trembling in the air, and Overseer Kresh smiled with something that might have been approval. "Good," she said. "Now hold it there until I tell you to stop, and perhaps I will tell you which of those things I said were true." I held the sphere aloft for 47 minutes, before my concentration finally broke, and it fell. By then, my nose was bleeding again. My head felt like it was splitting open, and my hands were shaking uncontrollably. Kresh never did tell me which parts had been true. I suspect they all were. Evenings brought academic instruction, though this too differed significantly from any education I had received before. We studied Sith philosophy, ancient texts that described the dark side not as evil, but as the natural state of the universa, power seeking to dominate weakness, the strong surviving while the weak perished, hierarchy and control as the only true path to order. We learned the history of the Sith Order, its ancient roots on Korriban, and its long struggle against the Jedi, who were portrayed as deluded fools who denied the fundamental truths of existence in favor of comforting lies about balance and serenity. We studied anatomy, learning which points on the body were most vulnerable, how to cause maximum pain with minimum effort, how to kill quickly or slowly, depending on tactical requirements. We learned about the various species that made up the Empire and the galaxy beyond, their weaknesses and strengths, their typical psychological profiles, and how to exploit them. And we learned about pain. Specifically, we learned about the nervous system, about how pain signals traveled and how they could be amplified or redirected through force techniques. We learned this not from lectures alone, but from practical demonstrations. The overseers would select volunteer Sa, or simply designate victims Sa, and demonstrate various dark side techniques on them while the rest of us observed and took mental notes. How to create the sensation of burning without causing physical damage. How to overload proprioception until the victim could no longer distinguish their body from their surroundings. How to induce cardiac arrest and then restart the heart, creating the experience of death followed by resurrection. I was selected for such demonstrations 7 times during my first year. I do not remember most of them clearly. The mind has ways of protecting itself from memories too terrible to process. But I remember the first time when Overseer Kresh used me to demonstrate a technique called nerve cascade, which involved systematically activating every pain receptor in the body in sequence, creating a wave of agony that traveled from the extremities toward the core. I remember screaming until my voice gave out, and then continuing to scream silently, my body arcing against restraints. I did not remember being placed under. I remember the clinical discussion happening above me as I suffered, the overseer explaining to the class exactly which neural pathways she was targeting and why. And I remember, when it was finally over and they released me to collapse on the stone floor, the way my fellow acolytes looked at me, not with sympathy or horror, but with academic interest, evaluating what they had learned and how they might apply those techniques themselves. We were being transformed into monsters, and we were beginning to accept it as necessary. The nights were our only respite, and even these were not free from the Academy's influence. We were allowed 6 hours of sleep, rarely more, and even this was often interrupted. Sometimes the overseers would conduct surprise inspections, forcing us to stand at attention while they searched our pallets for contraband or evidence of forbidden attachments. Sometimes they would simply activate pain fields in the dormitory, low-level force abilities that created general discomfort throughout the room, making restful sleep impossible. They wanted us exhausted, always operating below peak efficiency, because exhaustion wore down the mental defenses that might otherwise resist indoctrination. But even exhausted, we found ways to survive. Alliances formed, though we were warned against them. The Academy preached self-reliance and taught us that trust was weakness. But humans saw, and most sentient species saw, are social creatures by nature. We needed connection, even if those connections were tactical rather than genuine. Small groups coalesced around compatibility or mutual benefit. The stronger acolytes would sometimes protect weaker ones in exchange for various services, help with academic work, warnings about overseer moods, simple companionship that made the isolation more bearable. I formed such an alliance with 3 others. Karul, a human from Ziost whose family had been bureaucrats like mine. Kresh, a Zabrak female who had survived the initial trial through sheer stubborn refusal to die. And Riven, a pure-blood male whose traditional Sith ancestry gave him certain advantages in force sensitivity, but also made him a target for overseers who expected more from his bloodline. We did not trust each other. Trust implied vulnerability, and vulnerability was death in the Academy. But we coordinated. Why? We shared information about which overseers were in foul moods and should be avoided, which training exercises had recently caused injuries and how to minimize risk, which academic subjects would be emphasized in upcoming examinations. When one of us was selected for punishment or demonstration, the others would ensure they paid attention and remembered the details, so that the suffering at least generated useful knowledge. Karul was the first of us to kill another acolyte. It happened during our 4th month, in an advanced sparring session. We had progressed beyond training staves to practice saber saw, still not true lightsabers, which would not be granted until we achieved full acolyte status, but weapons that carried an energy charge capable of inflicting serious injury. The exercise was simple: full contact dueling, no safety protocols, fight until one combatant yielded or was incapacitated. Karul's opponent was a human named Dren, who had made himself unpopular through a combination of incompetence and a whining, entitled attitude that grated on everyone around him. Dren had complained endlessly about the Academy's harshness, about how his wealthy family would have him released, about how the overseers were being unnecessarily cruel. None of us had much sympathy, We were all suffering equally, but Dren seemed to believe his suffering was somehow more unjust than ours. The duel began poorly for Dren. He was slow, his form sloppy, his connection to the Force weak and uncontrolled. Karul pressed the advantage, driving him back across the training hall with a series of strikes that Dren barely managed to block. Within 30 seconds, it was clear who would win. Dren threw down his practice saber and raised his hands. I yield. Karul hesitated. The rules were clear, Yielding was supposed to end the match. But I saw something flicker across his face, some calculation or decision, and instead of stepping back, he thrust forward and drove his practice saber through Dren's chest. The energy blade punched through sternum and heart and emerged from Dren's back in a spray of blood and cauterized tissue. Dren looked down at the weapon embedded in his chest with an expression of confused surprise, as if he could not quite process what had happened. Then he fell backward, dead before he hit the stone. The training hall went silent. Everyone knowing, the 24 remaining acolytes, the 3 overseers supervising the session, turned to look at Karul, who stood over the body with his practice saber still ignited, breathing hard. One of the overseers, a pureblood named Overseer Tremel, walked slowly across the hall. We waited for punishment, for rage, for some response to this violation of protocol. Instead, Tremel looked down at the body, then up at Karul. Why? Karul met his gaze without flinching. He was weak. Keeping him alive would have wasted resources that could be better spent on those of us who have potential. Nay? Tremel considered this for a long moment. Then he smiled. Practical, ruthless, efficient. He looked around at the rest of us. This is what a Sith does, not following rules like a slave, but making decisions based on power and utility. Tren was correct to yield. He had lost, but Karul was more correct to kill him anyway, because Dren's continued existence served no purpose. He turned back to Karul. You will clean up the body yourself. Consider it your reward for demonstrating initiative. From that day forward, yielding in sparring matches became meaningless. We fought to incapacitation or death, because anything less invited the opponent to kill us anyway. The pace of attrition increased. 2 more acolytes died in training during the following week. I'm dissected. One fell during a climbing exercise in the Valley of the Dark Lords, her grip failing on the rock face, her scream echoing off the ancient tombs as she plummeted to the canyon floor below. Another simply vanished from his pallet one night, taken by person or persons unknown, his body discovered 3 days later in one of the waste disposal chambers, tortured extensively before death. The overseers investigated this second death, but half-heartedly. They knew what had happened. One or more acolytes had decided to eliminate competition, but they did not seem to care about identifying the specific perpetrators. Murder, like everything else in the academy, was simply another form of training. We were 22 now, 22 survivors from the original 43, and we had not yet completed our first year. The academy had multiple levels of advancement, we learned. The first trial, which we had passed in that circle of torment during our first day, merely qualified us as provisional acolytes. To advance to full acolyte status, to earn the black robes and the right to carry a training lightsaber, Wei would need to pass the trials of advancement, a series of tests that made the first trial look gentle by comparison. But before we could attempt those trials, we needed to master basic force techniques: telekinesis, telepathic projection, force, enhancement of physical abilities, and, most importantly, force lightning. The lightning was considered the signature ability of a dark side practitioner, the visible manifestation of channeling hatred and pain into destructive power. Every Sith learned it eventually, and many used it as their primary weapon, more reliable and personal than any lightsaber. Learning to produce force lightning was among the most painful experiences of my time at the academy, which was saying something given the catalog of suffering I had already endured. The technique required channeling intense emotion, anger, hatred, or pain, through one's connection to the force, and then projecting it outward as electrical energy. But the energy did not simply flow through you harmlessly. It burned. Every time you generated lightning, you were essentially electrocuting yourself from the inside, allowing that current to build until it could arc out through your fingertips toward a target. The first time I attempted it, I managed to generate a small spark that jumped from my hand to a practice target, perhaps half a meter away. The effort left me gasping, my arm numb from the elbow down, every muscle in my hand cramping simultaneously. The overseer, observing my attempt, Overseer Kresh inevitably was unimpressed. Again, she commanded. I tried. Summoned my anger, my hatred of this place and these people and the situation that had brought me here. Felt the force respond, felt the charge building in my core. But when I tried to project it outward, the energy dissipated, grounding itself through my body instead of arching toward the target. I collapsed, convulsing as electricity coursed through my nervous system. Again. This continued for hours. Build the charge, fail to project it, electrocute myself. Build it again, manage a small spark, collapse from the effort. Again and again, until I could no longer feel my arms, until my vision was flickering and my heart was beating irregularly, and every breath felt like inhaling broken glass. Again, I wanted to refuse. Wanted to tell her I could not, that I had reached my limit, that continuing would kill me. But refusal was not permitted, and besides, some part of me understood that this was the point. The Academy was teaching me that limits were illusions, that what I believed was my breaking point was merely a barrier to push through on the way to discovering what I actually could endure. I summoned everything I had left: rage at Kresh for torturing me, rage at myself for being weak, rage at the universe for creating a reality where power was the only thing that mattered. The Force responded like it never had before, a surge of dark energy that felt like swallowing fire. I screamed and thrust my hands toward the target, and lightning erupted from my fingertips. Real lightning, sustained and focused, arcing across 3 meters to strike the target dead center. The target, a plasteel dummy designed to absorb electrical current, glowed and began to melt. The lightning kept coming, pouring out of me in a continuous stream, and I could not stop it. The energy was flowing, both outward and inward, simultaneously, frying my nervous system even as it destroyed the target. Finally, Overseer Kresh made a gesture, and the flow cut off abruptly. I fell forward onto my hands and knees, smoke rising from my fingertips, my entire body shaking. "Adequate," Kresh said. "You will practice this daily until you can sustain the flow for a full minute without losing consciousness." I barely made it back to the dormitory before collapsing on my pallet. Kresh helped me to the washroom later, supporting my weight as my legs refused to work properly, and cleaned the burns on my hands where the lightning had seared my own flesh. She did not speak, and neither did I. There was nothing to say. This was simply what the Academy required, and we would either meet those requirements or die trying. Over the following weeks, I practiced Force Lightning until I could generate it reliably, until I could control its intensity and duration, until I could target specific locations with reasonable accuracy. The burns became calluses, the pain became manageable, and what had initially felt like tearing myself apart became merely uncomfortable. The same process repeated for every Force technique we learned. Telekinesis required crushing headaches as we forced our will onto matter that resisted manipulation. Telepathic projection meant broadcasting our thoughts into others' minds, an invasive sensation that left both sender and receiver feeling violated and exposed. Force-enhanced speed and strength required pushing our bodies past safe limits, accepting the inevitable damage to muscles and joints as the price of superhuman performance. We were not training to use the Force. We were training to survive using it. The Academy's philosophy became clearer over time. The Jedi, we were taught, approached the Force as something to be respected and worked with, a partnership between practitioner and cosmic energy. They trained slowly and carefully, building sustainable techniques that would not harm the user. They emphasized control, restraint, and balance. The Sith rejected all of this as weakness. The dark side was not meant to be comfortable or sustainable. It was meant to be overwhelming, destructive, a weapon you wielded despite the cost to yourself. Every time you channeled the dark side, you were gambling that your strength would be sufficient to contain and direct it, that you could inflict more damage on your enemies than it inflicted on you in the process. Many acolytes lost that gamble. I watched a student named Vihen attempt to force push a massive stone block during a telekinesis exercise, channeling more power than his body could handle. His own technique crushed his ribcage, the Force projecting inward as well as outward, and he died coughing blood while the overseers observed with clinical interest, discussing what he had done wrong and how the rest of us could avoid similar mistakes. I watched another acolyte, whose name I never learned, attempt to probe an overseer's mind without permission during a telepathy lesson. The overseer retaliated instantly, invading the student's consciousness so completely that when it was over, the acolyte could no longer remember her own name, her language, or how to perform basic self-care functions. They led her away drooling and vacant-eyed, and we never saw her again. The lesson was clear. Power without control was suicide, but excessive caution was equally deadly. We had to find the narrow path between restraint and ambition, had to push ourselves constantly without pushing so hard that we self-destructed. It was a calculation that consumed every moment of our existence, every decision from how hard to train to how much to eat, to how long to sleep, because the Academy did not simply want us powerful. It wanted us sustainable. A Sith who burned themselves out in a few years was less valuable than one who could serve the Empire for decades. But a Sith who was too cautious, too protective of themselves, would never achieve the power necessary to be useful in the first place. We were being shaped into weapons that would not break with the first use, but that required us to be broken repeatedly during the forging process, tested to destruction, and beyond to identify our true limits. By the time we approached our first year's end, we were 13. 13 survivors from 43, and every one of us bore scars, both visible and invisible. We moved differently than we had upon arrival, faster, more precisely, with the unconscious economy of motion that came from constant combat training. We spoke differently, our voices harder and colder, stripped of the verbal habits that marked civilian life. We thought differently, our minds now structured around hierarchies of power and utility, rather than the social networks and emotional connections that had organized our previous lives. We had become acolytes in truth, not just in title. We wore the black robes now, having been formally promoted after a final examination that tested everything we had learned. The examination had claimed 2 more students, one dead from cardiac arrest during the physical component, another driven mad during the mental stress test, and currently residing in whatever facility the Academy maintained for the permanently broken. The 11 of us who remained were issued training lightsabers, weapons that marked us as having proven basic competency in the Force. They were not the elegant weapons that full Sith carried. These training sabers had power limiters and shortened blades, designed to maim rather than kill with a single strike. But they were real lightsabers nonetheless. And holding one for the first time felt significant in ways I had not anticipated. The weapon hummed in my grip, its blade a deep crimson that painted everything around me in shades of blood. I could feel it drawing on the Force, channeling energy through kyber crystal and focusing lens, and it responded to my intentions with an immediacy that made it feel less like a tool and more like an extension of my own will. Overseer Kresh, observing the ceremony where we received these weapons, addressed us with something that might have been approval in her voice. "You are no longer provisional," she said. "You have survived the first culling and proven you possess the minimum strength required to potentially serve the Empire. But understand, this is not an achievement. This is merely permission to continue. The true trials lie ahead, and most of you will fail them." She paused, looking at each of us in turn. "The trials of advancement will test you in ways that the first trial and your training so far have not. You will be sent into the Valley of the Dark Lords to face the spirits of ancient Sith, beings of pure dark side energy, who will attack your mind and soul directly. You will compete against each other for limited resources and opportunities. You will be given tasks that cannot all be completed, choices where every option results in loss. And you will do all of this knowing that your fellow acolytes are your greatest threat, that any of them would kill you without hesitation if it served their advancement." "Nay." She smiled that terrible smile. "Welcome to the true Academy. Everything until now has been preparation. What comes next is selection." They gave us 1 week to prepare. 1 week of rest, relative rest anyway, as the Academy did not truly offer such a thin tato recover from the examination, to train with our new weapons, and to prepare mentally for what was coming. During that week, the nature of our relationships with each other shifted noticeably. The alliances that had formed, the small bonds of mutual assistance and companionship, began to fray as everyone calculated odds and made plans. Karul, Thesh, Riven, and I still coordinated to some degree, but there was new wariness in our interactions, new hesitation about sharing information. We all understood what the trials would require. Some of us would advance. Others would die or fail, and success might well require betraying the very people we had relied upon for survival. up to this point. The Academy had spent a year teaching us that attachment was weakness, that trust was vulnerability, that the only relationship that mattered was the hierarchy of power. Now it would test whether we had learned those lessons thoroughly enough to apply them even to those we had come to depend upon. I spent much of that week in meditation, sitting alone in one of the small chambers and opening myself to the dark side, trying to sense what was coming. The Force showed me fragmenta, images of violence, echoes of ancient cruelty, the weight of expectations from powers I could not yet comprehend. Nothing concrete, nothing I could use to prepare specifically, just a general sense of impending crisis. On the night before the trials began, I did not sleep. None of us did. We lay on our pallets in the dormitory, 11 acolytes in our black robes, carrying weapons that marked us as predators in training, each of us alone with our thoughts and fears and ambitions. The hum of the generators deep in the mountain seemed louder that night, or perhaps I was simply more aware of it, that constant vibration that had accompanied every moment of my time in this place. It had become part of me, I realized. The Academy had gotten into my bones, had restructured my nervous system around pain and power, had rewritten my identity until I could no longer clearly remember who I had been before arriving here. I was no longer the naive young person who had boarded a transport thinking the Academy was an honor. That person had died in the circle during the first trial, or perhaps during one of the countless agonies that followed. What remained was something harder, something shaped by suffering into a form that could potentially survive what was coming. But survival alone was not enough. The Academy had made that clear repeatedly. We were expected to thrive, to dominate, to demonstrate that we could not merely endure the dark side, but master it and bend it to our will. As I lay there in the darkness, listening to the quiet breathing of the other acolytes and the eternal hum of the generators, I wondered if any of us truly could, or if we were all just victims pretending to be victors, broken things that had learned to call their breaking strength. The morning came too soon. They roused us early, even earlier than usual, when the sky beyond the Academy's walls was still dark, and the air carried the chill of desert night. We assembled in the courtyard, 11 acolytes standing in perfect formation, our training sabers hanging from our belts, our black robes stirring in the pre-dawn wind. Overseer Kresh stood before us, flanked by 2 other overseers and a tall figure whose face was hidden deep within a hooded cloak. This last figure radiated power in a way that made even the overseers seem weak by comparison. Full Sith Lord, I realized. Someone who had graduated from the Academy and risen through the ranks to achieve true mastery. The trials of advancement begin today, Kresh announced. You will enter the Valley of the Dark Lords at dawn and proceed to the tomb of Nagasato. Inside that tomb, you will face 3 challenges, each one designed to test a different aspect of your potential. You will face them alone. No cooperation, no assistance, no mercy from your fellows. She gestured toward the valley, visible now as a dark shadow against the lightening sky. The tomb is warded. The spirits of ancient Sith still dwell there, remnants of power so vast that even their ghosts are dangerous. They will test you. Some of you will be possessed, your bodies used as puppets for ancient wills that care nothing for your survival. Some will be driven mad by visions of futures or pasts too terrible to process. Some will simply be destroyed, your minds crushed by contact with beings who abide. The hooded Sith Lord spoke then, and his voice was like stone grinding against stone, deep and resonant and utterly without warmth. Those who succeed will be granted the title of Sith Apprentice and assigned to a master for advanced training. Those who fail will die or worse. There is no third option, no partial credit, no mercy for good attempts. He turned toward the valley. You have 1 hour before sunrise. Use it to prepare yourselves, because once you enter that tomb, the only thing that will save you is strength. Raw, absolute, merciless strength. We were dismissed then, given that hour to meditate or train, or simply wait. I chose meditation, finding a quiet corner of the courtyard, and sinking into the dark side, letting it flow through me, and steel my resolve for what was coming. I could feel the other acolytes around me, their presences in the Force distinct and recognizable after a year of training together. Karul's presence felt sharp and focused, like a blade being honed. Thesh radiated stubborn determination, a refusal to be broken that had sustained her through everything the Academy had inflicted. Riven's presence was complex, layered with the expectations of his pureblood ancestry and the fear that he might not live up to them. And beneath us all, beneath the Academy and the mountain itself, I could feel something vast and ancient stirring, aware that new prey was about to enter its domain. The Valley of the Dark Lords was not merely a place where powerful Sith had been buried. It was a nexus of dark side energy, built up over millennia of death and cruelty, and the concentration of malevolent power. The spirits that dwelled there were not passive remnants but active predators, feeding on the fear and suffering of those foolish enough to enter their territory. We were being sent to fight ghosts that had once been gods. The sun rose, painting the valley in shades of red and gold that somehow made it look even more forbidding. The tombs carved into the valley walls became visible, massive structures that suggested civilizations long vanished. Power that had once reshaped worlds now reduced to architectural corpses, slowly being reclaimed by sand and time. "Move out," Overseer Kresh commanded. We descended into the valley in single file, following an ancient path that wound between massive stone monuments and smaller cairns that marked the graves of lesser Sith who had earned burial here. The temperature dropped as we descended, the narrow walls blocking the sun and creating a permanent twilight that felt unnatural and oppressive. Nothing lived in the valley. No plants, no insects, no birds circling overhead. The dark side had poisoned this place so thoroughly that even the hardiest desert organisms could not survive. Our footsteps echoed strangely, seeming to come from directions they should not have, and sometimes I thought I heard voices whispering just below the threshold of perception, speaking in languages that predated the Republic. The tomb of Nagasato stood at the valley's deepest point, where the walls rose highest and the shadows were darkest. It was a massive structure, its entrance carved to resemble a mouth with teeth of stone, its interior disappearing into absolute darkness that seemed to resist the morning light. We stopped before the entrance. No. 11 acolytes, staring into darkness, each of us knowing that not all of us would emerge. Overseer, Kresh gestured. "One at a time, 5-minute intervals. The order will be determined by your performance rankings from the past year." They called names. Riven was first, his pureblood status and strong force sensitivity having placed him at the top of the class. He walked toward the tomb entrance without hesitation, his training saber ignited, the red blade barely penetrating the darkness. He crossed the threshold, and the shadows seemed to swallow him whole. We waited. 5 minutes passed with agonizing slowness. Then, they called the next name. One by one, my fellow acolytes entered the tomb. Mew. Some went with confidence, others with visible fear, but all went because there was no alternative. Refusal meant execution. The only path forward was through. I was 8th in the order. I watched 7 acolytes disappear into that hungry darkness before my name was called. Thesh went in 6th, and I tried to sense what was happening to her through the Force, but the tomb's wards blocked all external perception. Whatever was occurring inside happened in perfect isolation. Acolyte 17, Overseer Kresh said. They had never learned my birth name, or perhaps they had deliberately chosen not to use it. Enter. Raul. I walked toward the tomb, each step feeling heavier than the last. The entrance seemed to pulse with dark energy, and as I drew closer, I could hear that whispering more clearly, hundreds or thousands of voices, all speaking at once, some in anger, some in pain, some in cold amusement at the fresh suffering about to unfold. I crossed the threshold, and the light from outside vanished completely. The darkness inside the tomb was absolute, so complete that my eyes could not adjust because there was literally nothing to see. I ignited my training saber, and the red glow pushed back the shadows perhaps half a meter in all directions, creating a small bubble of visibility that moved with me as I advanced. The corridor I found myself in was carved from solid rock, The walls covered in Sith script that I could not read, but whose meaning I could somehow sense as warnings, threats, promises of power to those strong enough to claim it. The floor was smooth and sloped downward, leading deeper into the mountain's heart. I walked carefully, my saber raised, my other hand extended to sense disturbances in the force. The whispers surrounded me now, coming from all directions, growing louder as I descended. Some of them spoke names I did not recognize. Others spoke about events I had never heard of. But underneath the specific words was a common theme. Hunger. These spirits were hungry, desperate for sensation and life, and the chance to exist again, even briefly, through hijacking the bodies of the living. The corridor opened into a chamber, and my saber's light revealed massive stone pillars carved with more script, a vaulted ceiling lost in shadows above, and a floor covered in bones. Human bones mostly, though some were from species I could not identify. Hundreds of them, perhaps thousands, scattered across the stone like trash. "Welcome," a voice said from everywhere and nowhere at once. I spun, trying to locate the source, but there was no source. The voice existed directly in my mind, bypassing my ears entirely. "You seek power," the voice continued. "You have been taught to crave it, to sacrifice everything for it. So eager, so hungry, so perfectly shaped for what I need." Something moved in the shadows beyond my saber's light, a shape that was not quite human, flowing through the air like smoke, its edges indistinct and constantly shifting. "The first trial," the voice said, "is simple. Prove you are stronger than I am. Resist possession or surrender, and let me feast on your flesh while you watch helplessly from inside your own skull." The shape rushed toward me faster than thought, and I raised my saber instinctively, but the blade passed through it without resistance. The entity was not physical. It struck me dead center in the chest, and I felt it enter my mind like a spike of ice driven through my brain. Suddenly I was fighting on two fronts. My body still stood in that chamber, but my consciousness was locked in mental combat with something vast and ancient and utterly malevolent. The spirit battered against my defenses, trying to find weaknesses, trying to pry open my identity and hollow me out so it could wear my body like a suit of meat. I felt it probing my memories, watching my training, examining my fears. It was learning me, understanding what I was and how I worked, searching for the precise vulnerability that would allow it to break through my resistance. "You are weak," the spirit hissed, its voice now inside my head. "Barely trained, barely tested. You think a year in the academy prepared you for this? I have consumed apprentices more powerful than you will ever be. I have worn the bodies of dark lords and walked among the living in stolen flesh. What chance does a child have against me?" It was right. I could feel the truth of its words. It was stronger than me, more experienced, more skilled in this kind of combat. If this were a simple contest of power, I would lose. But the academy had not trained me to be powerful. Not yet. It had trained me to survive despite being weak. It had taught me to endure, to function while broken, to find narrow paths through impossible situations. I stopped resisting directly. Instead, I opened myself to the dark side completely, letting it flow through me without restraint, and channeled everything I had felt over the past year, every moment of pain, every instant of humiliation, every second of rage at what had been done to me, directly at the spirit. I showed it the circle where I had crawled through the blood of my fellow students. One showed it the medical chambers where they had repaired my body only to break it again. Showed it the meditation cells where I had been tortured into opening myself to the very force that was now attacking me. I poured my suffering into the spirit like poison, making it experience everything the academy had inflicted on me, forcing it to feel what I had felt. The spirit recoiled. It had expected resistance, expected me to fight it with strength or willpower or some other conventional defense. It had not expected me to weaponize my own trauma, to turn my breaking into a weapon that could break in turn. "What are you?" it whispered, and for the first time there was uncertainty in its voice. "I am what you made," I told it, and that was true in a way that transcended this specific confrontation. The dark side had shaped me, the Academy had forged me, and what emerged from that process was something that could channel suffering in ways the spirit did not anticipate. I pushed harder, forcing my experiences deeper into its consciousness, and the spirit began to fragment. It was old and powerful, but it was also tired, worn down by millennia of existence without substance. My pain was fresh and vital and intense in ways its ancient memories could no longer match. The spirit fled, withdrawing from my mind with a sensation like hooks being torn from flesh. I gasped and staggered, my physical body responding to the mental trauma. But I remained standing, remained conscious, remained myself. "The first trial is complete," a different voice announced. This one calmer and more formal. "Proceed to the second chamber." A doorway opened in the far wall, revealing another corridor descending deeper still. I took a moment to steady myself. Me nose was bleeding again, a familiar sensation by no one. Then continued forward. The second chamber was different. No bones, no pillars, just a small room with smooth walls and a single stone pedestal in the center. On the pedestal sat 3 data pads, each one displaying a different scenario. "The second trial tests judgment," the formal voice explained. "Each scenario describes a situation you will eventually face as a Sith. You must choose which choice to make. There are no correct answers, only choices that reveal character. Choose wisely, Jot."
"Not either way. Your choice will be recorded and will influence what opportunities you are offered in future."
I approached the pedestal and read the first scenario. "You discover your master is planning to betray the Dark Council. You have evidence that would condemn them, but also implicate you by association. Do you A. Report them and accept punishment for your association, B. Warn them and hope they remember your loyalty, or C. Say nothing and prepare to benefit from whoever emerges victorious?" The second scenario. A rival Sith offers to share power with you if you help them destroy a third party who threatens you both. You know the rival will betray you eventually. Do you A. Accept the alliance and prepare your own betrayal, B. Refuse and face both enemies simultaneously, or C. Warn the third party and form a different alliance? The third scenario. You learn that completing your current mission will result in the deaths of millions of innocent civilians. Your master expects success, and failure will likely mean your death. The civilians are not citizens of the Empire. Do you A. Complete the mission, B. Sabotage it and face consequences, or C. Complete the mission, but leave evidence suggesting your master ordered unnecessary atrocities? I stared at the scenarios for a long time. They were hideous in their precision, each one designed to have no good option, every choice resulting in compromised ethics, or dangerous exposure, or betrayal of someone. This was what it meant to be Sithatano, wielding power for clear purposes, but navigating endless situations where morality and survival conflicted, where every decision required accepting some form of corruption. I made my choices. I will not record them here, not because they were particularly shameful among the options available, but because speaking them aloud would force me to confront more directly what they revealed about who I had become. When I finished, the datapads went dark, and a third doorway opened. The second trial is complete. Proceed to the final chamber. No. Nash. The third chamber was the largest yet, a vast space whose dimensions I could not fully perceive even with my saber's light. The air here felt thick, heavy with accumulated dark side energy, and I could sense multiple presences moving in the shadow saw. More spirits, or perhaps the same ones I had already encountered, drawn by the prospect of fresh prey. In the center of the chamber stood a figure that was not a spirit. Another acolyte, one of my classmates, though I could not immediately identify which one in the dim light. They had their back to me, their training saber ignited, facing something I could not see. The final trial, the formal voice announced, tests strength directly. You must defeat the guardian of this chamber. Whether you do so alone or with assistance is your choice. But be aware, all resources are limited, and generosity may prove costly. The figure in the center turned, and I recognized Karul. He looked terrible. His robes were torn, blood ran from numerous wounds, and his eyes had the glassy, distant quality of someone running on pure survival instinct with nothing left in reserve. "Help me," he said, his voice hoarse. "It's too strong. I can't win alone." Then, from the shadows emerged the Guardian Na, a creature of solid darkness, vaguely humanoid but massive, easily 3 meters tall, its body covered in armor that seemed to be made from solidified shadow. It carried a weapon that might have been a sword, or might have been an extension of its own substance, and when it moved, reality seemed to distort around it. This was not a spirit that could be fought mentally. This was something physical, or at least solid enough to require physical combat, and it was clearly beyond what any single acolyte could reasonably defeat. Karul looked at me with desperate hope. "Please, we trained together. We helped each other survive. We can take this thing together and both pass the trial." I wanted to believe that. Wanted to think that cooperation was possible, that the Academy's lessons about betrayal and self-interest were not absolute truths, but just one option among many. But I remembered what Overseer Kresh had said. All resources are limited. If there were limited opportunities for advancement, limited positions available, then helping Karul succeed might mean denying myself the same opportunity. And I remembered what Karul himself had done months ago in that training hall. How he had killed Dren despite the yielding, despite the protocols, because it was practical and ruthless and efficient. The Guardian moved toward us both, its massive form gliding across the stone with unnatural grace. We had perhaps seconds to decide and fight together, or fight separately, or turn on each other while the Guardian watched. I made my choice. I lunged forward, not toward the Guardian but toward Karul, my training saber cutting through the space where his knee had been a moment before. He dodged, barely, his exhaustion slowing his reactions just enough that my blade scored a burning line across his thigh instead of severing the leg entirely. "What are you doing?" he screamed, stumbling backward, trying to maintain guard against both me and the Guardian simultaneously. I did not answer. There was nothing to say. We both understood what the Academy had made us into, what it required us to become. Attachment was weakness. Trust was vulnerability. And survival demanded that we be willing to sacrifice anyone, even those we had relied upon, if doing so served our advancement. The Guardian seemed content to watch, its massive form still but radiating attention, evaluating how we handled this situation. This was the test, I realized, not whether we could defeat the Guardian through cooperation, but whether we understood that cooperation itself was the trap. Karul's exhaustion made him slow. I was fresher, having faced only 2 trials to his presumably similar experiences, plus whatever time he had spent fighting the Guardian before I arrived. I pressed my advantage, driving him back with a series of strikes that he barely managed to parry, his defense growing weaker with each exchange. "We're supposed to be allies," he gasped, his voice breaking. "I protected you, shared information with you. We survived together." "We survived," I agreed, and thrust my saber through his shoulder, angling the blade down to sever tendons and muscle. "And now one of us will continue surviving." His saber fell from nerveless fingers. He dropped to his knees, clutching the wound, staring up at me with an expression that mixed pain and betrayal, and underneath it all, understanding. He had made the same calculation I was making now. Well, he would have done the same thing if our positions were reversed. "Do it quickly," he said quietly. I raised my saber for the killing stroke, and paused. Something in his eyes, some last remnant of the person he had been before the academy broke him, looked back at me with an expression I could not quite identify. Resignation, perhaps. Or relief that the suffering would finally end. I struck, and Karul fell forward, dead before he hit the stone. The Guardian moved then, flowing toward me with sudden speed, its dark blade swinging in an arc that would have bisected me if I had not rolled aside at the last instant. The blade struck stone where I had been standing and carved a deep gouge in the rock, demonstrating that this was not some phantom or illusion, but something solid and deadly. I came up moving, putting distance between myself and the creature, trying to assess its patterns. It was stronger, absurdly strong, each strike carrying enough force to shatter bone even through a successful block. It was not as fast as a force-enhanced Acolyte in full sprint, but fast enough that running was not a viable option. And it was durable. I could see marks on its armor where Karul had landed hits, but none of them seemed to have caused significant damage. Fighting it directly was suicide. But the Academy had not trained me to fight fair. It had trained me to survive by any means necessary, to find advantages in situations that seemed hopeless, to weaponize everything, including my own weakness. I ran, not away from the Guardian, but in a wide circle around the chamber, forcing it to pursue me. As I ran, I extended my awareness through the force, sensing the chamber's dimensions, the placement of pillars and walls, the scattered debris from previous trials. The Guardian followed, relentless and patient, not rushing because it knew I would eventually tire. But I was not looking for an escape route. I was looking for weapons. I found what I needed near the chamber's far wall, a section of ceiling that had partially collapsed, leaving large stones balanced precariously above. I positioned myself beneath them, facing the Guardian as it approached, my saber raised in a defensive stance that suggested I was preparing to make a final stand. The Guardian accepted the invitation, moving toward me with that gliding motion, its blade rising for a strike that would cleave me in half. I waited until it was directly beneath the unstable section of ceiling, then reached upward with the force and pull. The stones fell. Tons of rock crashed down on the Guardian's position, and I threw myself aside, rolling clear of the collapse. Dust filled the chamber, choking and blinding, and I lay flat on the stone, trying to sense through the force whether the trap had worked. The Guardian stirred beneath the rubble. Of course it did not. Ancient darkside constructs were not so easily destroyed, but it was pinned, at least temporarily, massive stones pressing down on its form and limiting its movement. I approached carefully, my saber ready, and found the Guardian's head protruding from the rubble, its featureless face turned toward me. It did not seem angry or afraid. It did not seem to have emotions at all, merely purpose and function. I drove my saber through where its eyes would be, if it had possessed a conventional anatomy, putting all my strength behind the thrust, channeling the force to enhance the blade's cutting power. The saber sank deep, and something vital within the Guardian gave way. Its form began to dissolve, the solid darkness evaporating back into shadow, until nothing remained but dust and the stones that had briefly pinned it. "The final trial is complete," the formal voice announced. "You have demonstrated possession resistance, judgment under pressure, and tactical superiority. You are worthy of advancement." A doorway opened in the chamber wall, leading not deeper into the tomb but upward, toward light. I could see sky through the opening, the red gold of late afternoon sun, and realized I had been in the tomb for most of the day. I walked toward the exit, stepping over Karul's body without looking down. I did not want to see his face again, did not want to remember the expression he had worn in those final moments. He had been my ally, my companion through a year of suffering, and I had killed him because that was what advancement required. The Academy had taught me well. I emerged from the tomb into the Valley of the Dark Lords as the sun was setting, painting everything in shades of blood and shadow. Overseer Kresh stood near the entrance along with the hooded Sith Lord, and several other overseers I did not recognize. Around them stood 5 other Acolytes, the survivors of the trials. 5 of us? From 11 who entered, only 5 emerged. Thesh was there, I was relieved to see, though she looked even more damaged than when she had entered, fresh burns covering her arms and part of her face. Riven was there as well, though something in his eyes had changed, some fundamental shift that suggested he had broken in a way that would never fully heal. 2 others I recognized, but had never been close with aught human woman named Kes and a Zabrak male called Drovith. 5 survivors, the Sith Lord said, his grinding voice carrying across the valley. Better than average for a trial cycle. You have all proven you possess the minimum requirements for further training. He paused. Me. You are now Sith apprentices. You will be assigned to masters who will continue your education. Some of you will advance to become Sith Lords in time. Most will die in service to the Empire, but you will die as Sith, which is more than 95% of those who begin this path can claim. No, he gestured, and servants appeared carrying black robesaw, different from our Acolyte robes, these marked with red trim that signified our new status. We were issued new weapons as well, proper lightsabers without the power limiters of training models, fully capable of killing with a single strike. Your masters have been selected based on your performance and specializations, Overseer Kresh said, consulting a datapad. You will report to them immediately. She read off assignments. Riven was assigned to a lord who specialized in Sith sorceria, appropriate for his strong force sensitivity, but damaged psyche. Kes was assigned to a master who trained assassins and operatives. Drovith was given to a brutal warrior who valued physical strength above all else. Apprentice 17? Kresh said, looking at me. You are assigned to Lord Vexus, specialist in intelligence operations and strategic manipulation. Report to the 3rd level, Eastern Wing, Chamber 47. Yuan Dalme. Thesh was assigned last, given to a master whose name I did not recognize, but whose reputation Kresh described as demanding but fair, which in Sith terms means she will torture you extensively, but always for pedagogical purposes. We were dismissed then, sent to find our new masters and begin the next phase of our training. As I walked back toward the academy, Thesh fell into step beside me. Karul? She asked quietly. Dead. Dead. She nodded, unsurprised. Riven killed 2 others in his trial. They set the acolytes against each other deliberately. Of course they did. We walked in silence for a while, 2 survivors of a massacre disguised as education, wearing the robes of our advancement like funeral shrouds. Do you think it gets better? Thesh asked. After apprenticeship, after we become full Sith Hadi-dos, it get easier. I thought about that question. Thought about what I had seen of the Sith Lords and Overseers, the way they moved through the academy dispensing cruelty with casual efficiency, the way they seemed to regard even their own students as resources to be consumed or enemies to be dominated. No, I said finally. I don't think it gets better. I think we just get stronger, and being stronger lets us survive worse things. But the suffering never stops. It just changes form. Thesh nodded slowly. Then why continue? It was a good question. Why continue down a path that promised nothing but escalating horror, that required us to become monsters in order to survive, that would inevitably either kill us or transform us into something worse than death? Because the alternative is to have suffered for nothing, I said. Because we've already paid in blood and pain and pieces of our souls, and walking away now means accepting that the price was wasted. Because I paused, searching for words to describe something I barely understood myself. Because the dark side is in us now. It's part of us. We can't go back to being who we were before, so the only direction left is forward. Even if forward leads to destruction? Especially then. The Sith don't fear destruction. We embrace it. We become it. Thesh was quiet for a long moment. Joe, when did you start believing that? I did not have an answer. The indoctrination had been so gradual, so persistent, so woven through every aspect of our existence that I could not identify when exactly the Academy's philosophy had stopped being something imposed from outside and started being something I genuinely believed. We parted ways at the main corridor intersection, Thesh heading to the western wing to find her master, me continuing east. I did not expect to see her again, at least not as an ally. The trials had demonstrated that alliances among Sith were temporary at best, tactical arrangements that would be abandoned the moment they became inconvenient. I found Chamber 47 without difficulty. The door was sealed, but when I approached, it hissed open automatically, responding to my presence. Inside was a spacious office, well lit by glow panels, and furnished with actual comforta chairs that looked soft, a desk made of real wood instead of stone or metal. Even a small viewport showing a holographic image of a forest world I did not recognize. Behind the desk sat Lord Vexus. She was human, middle-aged by appearance, though I suspected Sith medical technology made age difficult to judge accurately. Her face bore no obvious scarring or modification, her expression calm and evaluating as she examined me. She wore robes of black and deep purple, well-tailored and expensive, and her presence in the Force felt controlled and precise, rather than overwhelming and chaotic. "Apprentice 17, she said, her voice cultured and even. "Or do you prefer your birth name? I confess I find the Academy's numbering system dehumanizing, though I understand its pedagogical purpose." I hesitated. No one had asked me that question in over a year. "My birth name, Isal Wasa." I stopped, realizing I was not certain I should reveal it. The Academy had taught wariness about sharing information that could become vulnerability. Vexus smiled slightly. "The Academy has trained that caution into you well. Good. Paranoia is useful in our line of work." She gestured to one of the chairs. "Sit. We have much to discuss." I sat, my new lightsaber hanging from my belt, my body still aching from the trials, my mind still processing Karul's death, and what it meant about who I had become. "You performed adequately in the trials," Vexus continued. "The possession resistance was handled creatively out, weaponizing your own trauma rather than relying on raw strength. The judgment scenarios revealed a pragmatic tendency towards self-preservation, balanced against strategic positioning for future gain. And the Guardian Testa," she paused, "killing your ally to secure advancement, then using environmental advantages rather than direct combat to defeat a superior enemy. Ruthless and intelligent. Precisely the qualities I require in an apprentice." She stood and moved to the viewport, gazing at the holographic forest. "I am not like most Sith masters. I do not believe suffering for its own sake produces optimal results. I will torture you when torture serves a training purpose, but I will not torture you simply because I enjoy it, or because tradition demands it. I expect competence, loyalty, until it becomes tactically disadvantageous, and the intelligence to know when to betray me without getting caught." "Maybe. Now." I must have looked confused, because she smiled again. "Yes, I expect you will eventually betray me. All apprentices do, if they survive long enough to become powerful enough to attempt it. That is the Sith way. The apprentice grows strong enough to surpass the master, then takes their place. But the timeline matters. Betray me too early, and I will crush you easily. Wait too long, and you waste your potential serving when you should be commanding." She turned back to me. "My job is to train you well enough that when you finally attempt to kill me, it will be an interesting fight rather than an embarrassing one." This was unlike any Sith philosophy I had encountered at the Academy. Most of the overseers had preached absolute domination, treating apprentices as tools or slaves. Vexus seemed to regard our relationship as something more complex: temporary alliance, mutual exploitation, inevitable betrayal, all acknowledged openly, rather than hidden behind pretense of loyalty. "I understand you specialized in tactical analysis during your Acolyte training," she said, consulting a datapad. "Good intuition for reading battlefield situations, excellent ability to identify enemy weaknesses. Less impressive in terms of raw force power, but that can be developed over time. She set down the datapad. I command the Empire's intelligence network in 3 sectors. I analyze threats, identify opportunities, recommend strategies to the Dark Council. It is subtle work, requiring more thought than force, more patience than passion. Does this interest you? Yes, my lord, I said, because that was the expected answer, and because it was partially true. After a year of being broken down and built back up through direct violence, the prospect of work that required intellect rather than endurance had a certain appeal. We shall see, Vexus said. Your training begins immediately. You will have chambers adjacent to this office, more comfortable than the dormitory you're accustomed to, but still monitored and controlled. You will assist me with analysis work, learning through observation and practical application. And you will continue your force training under my supervision, developing the specific skills that intelligence work requires. Telepathy, mental manipulation, sensing, deception, projecting false. She moved toward the door, gesturing for me to follow. But first, you will rest. You survived something traumatic today, killed someone you had fought beside for a year. That creates psychological disruption that needs processing before it calcifies into dysfunction. The Empire values functional tools over broken ones. Now see. She led me down the corridor to a smaller chamber that contained actual furniture, a bed, not a pallet, a desk, a chair, even a small private washroom. Compared to the dormitory, it was luxurious. Compared to the quarters I had lived in before joining the academy, it was still a cell. Sleep, Vexus commanded. Tomorrow, we begin your real education. She left, the door sealing behind her. I stood in the middle of my new quarters, this space that was mine and mine alone for the first time in over a year, and felt the full weight of the day crash over me. I had survived, had advanced, had proven myself worthy of continued training. I should have felt pride or satisfaction or relief. Instead, I felt hollow. I sat on the bedaw, soft, astonishingly soft after months on Stona, and stared at my hands. These hands that had killed Karul. These hands that carried a lightsaber now, a weapon capable of cutting through almost anything, including whatever remained of my conscience. The dark side hummed through me, constant and familiar, that pressure in my chest that had become as natural as breathing. The academy had opened me to it, taught me to channel it, and now was part of me in ways I could never undo. Even if I fled, even if I somehow escaped the Empire entirely, I would carry this corruption with me forever. I thought about my parents, wondered if they were still alive, if they ever thought about what had become of the child they had sent to Korriban with such hope and pride. Did they understand what the academy actually was? Or had they believed the propaganda, thought I was being trained to serve the Empire nobly, rather than being broken into a weapon that would serve through fear of destruction? I would never know. Contact with family was forbidden after entering the academy. That chapter of my life was closed, sealed away behind walls of suffering and transformation. I lay back on the bed and closed my eyes, but sleep would not come. Every time I approached unconsciousness, I saw Karul's face in those final moments, that expression of understanding and resignation. He had known what I was going to do. He had known because he would have done the same. The academy had trained us both so thoroughly that our betrayal of each other was inevitable, predictable, practically scripted, and I had followed the script perfectly. Eventually, exhaustion overcame trauma, and I slept. My dreams were predictably terrible. The circle from the first trial, the Guardian's blade sweeping toward me, Karul falling with my saber through his chest, all of it repeating endlessly while the dark side whispered that this was my life now, that each advancement would require similar sacrifices, that I would climb toward power over a mountain of corpses that included everyone I had ever cared about. When I woke to the sound of a chime announcing morning, I felt no more rested than when I had lain down. But rest was not the goal. Function was the goal. The Empire did not need me rested, just operational. I rose, used the private washroom to clean the dried blood from my face and hands, and put on my new apprentice robes. The red trim stood out starkly against the black, a visual marker of status that would identify me as something more than an acolyte, but still far beneath a true Sith Lord. The door to my quarters opened before I reached it, Lord Vexus's voice coming through. "Report to my office immediately." I hurried down the corridor, finding her already at her desk. Multiple holographic displays showing what appeared to be star charts, troop movements, and intelligence reports. She gestured me to stand beside her. "Observe," she commanded. "This is the Atravis sector, Dogdegni. Republic forces have been repositioning along the border, but their patterns are inconsistent with normal defensive doctrine. What do you notice?" I studied the displays, trying to focus despite the lingering exhaustion and trauma. The troop movements did seem odd concentrations in areas that did not correspond to valuable targets, gaps in coverage that left strategic positions vulnerable. "They're spread too thin?" I offered hesitantly. "More specific." I looked more closely, comparing the current positions to what I remembered of standard military doctrine from our academic training. They're positioned as if defending multiple points simultaneously, but they don't have enough forces to actually defend any of them effectively. It's either incompetence or they're trying to make us think specific positions are important when they're actually baiting an attack. Vexus nodded, a gesture that might have been approval. "Correct. The Republic commander in this sector is smarter than average. She's creating a false impression of weakness, hoping we'll commit forces to what appears to be an easy target, then springing an ambush with reserves she's hidden through civilian ship manifests and commercial traffic pattern." She highlighted several areas on the display. "These trade routes show increased activity that doesn't correlate with economic factors. That's where her real strength is positioned." "No." She turned to me. "This is intelligence work. Not charging into battle with a lightsaber blazing, but reading patterns, identifying deceptions, seeing what enemies are trying to hide. It requires patience, attention to detail, and the ability to think from your opponent's perspective." She pulled up another display. "Your first assignment: review these reports from the Quell-E sector and identify any anomalies that might indicate Republic infiltration of our supply networks." I spent the next 8 hours reviewing reports, shipping manifests, cargo inspections, personnel transfers, maintenance logs. Thousands of data points, most of them routine and boring, all of them requiring careful analysis to identify patterns or inconsistencies. It was simultaneously less painful than academy training and more tedious than anything I had experienced there. My mind kept drifting, kept returning to the trials and what they meant, but every time my attention wavered, Lord Vexus would appear behind me and point out something I had missed, her voice calm, but carrying an edge that suggested disappointment was being noted and recorded. I found 3 anomalies: a shipping route that had changed pattern without corresponding change, instated cargo, a maintenance supervisor who had accessed secure systems outside their normal duties, and a series of small supply discrepancies that individually meant nothing but collectively suggested systematic theft or diversion. Vexus reviewed my findings without expression. "Adequate? 2 of these 3 are worth investigating further. The third, she highlighted the maintenance supervisor, "is a spy I placed in that facility months ago. You identifying them as suspicious means they're being too obvious and need retraining or replacement." She pulled up new displays. "Ow." "Continue. You have 6 more sectors to analyze before evening meditation." The work continued like this for weeks. Long hours analyzing intelligence, identifying patterns, learning to distinguish genuine threats from noise and misdirection. Between analysis sessions, Vexus trained me in the force techniques relevant to intelligence work: telepathy to read surface thoughts, mental manipulation to plant suggestions, sensing deception through emotional resonance. These techniques required a different approach to the force than I had learned in the academy. Instead of channeling raw hatred and pain into destructive power, I had to maintain cold control, using the dark side as a precision instrument rather than a blunt weapon. It was difficult, requiring levels of concentration and emotional regulation that the academy had actively worked to destroy. The Academy breaks you down, Vexus explained during one training session, because raw acolytes need to be broken before they can be shaped. But intelligence work requires putting some of those pieces back together in more functional arrangements. You need to be able to think clearly even while channeling the dark side to maintain strategic perspective instead of drowning in immediate emotional response. She demonstrated by reading my thoughts off, not deeply, just skimming surface impressions, but the violation was still obvious and uncomfortable. You're thinking about the trials, about the one you killed. You feel guilt, which is natural but ultimately useless. Transform it. Use it. Guilt means you still retain enough conscience to function in civilized society when necessary. That's valuable law. A purely psychopathic Sith can achieve great power, but makes a poor spy, because they lack the ability to convincingly. I tried to follow her guidance, tried to reshape my guilt into something useful, rather than something that simply hurt. It was harder than generating force lightning, harder than resisting possession. The Academy had taught me to weaponize suffering, but Vexus was teaching me something more complex: how to function with that suffering, how to carry damage without letting it completely destroy my capacity for thought and planning. Slowly, painfully, I began to develop the skills she required. I could read surface thoughts reliably after 6 weeks, deeper probing after 3 months. I could project false impressions of my own emotional state, hiding intentions behind manufactured feelings. I could sense when others were lying, feeling the discord between their words and their actual emotional state. And I could kill with the force when necessary, though Vexus emphasized this should be a last resort. Any fool with anger and a weapon can kill, she said. True power lies in manipulation, achieving your goals through others' actions, leaving no trail back to yourself, reshaping situations so your enemies destroy themselves while you watch from safety. 6 months into my apprenticeship, she deemed me ready for field work. There is a Republic intelligence asset operating on Dromund Kaas, she explained, showing me surveillance footage of a human woman moving through the capital's administrative districts. She's good. Been in place for 2 years. Valuable sources in multiple agencies. We've known about her for 4 months but left her operational because she's more useful feeding her false information than eliminating her. Now, Vexus pulled up more files. But now her network has expanded to include someone in the Dark Council's support staff. That crosses a line. She needs to be removed, but we need to do it cleanly. If the Republic realizes we've identified her, they'll burn their entire network and rebuild, costing us years of counterintelligence work. She looked at me directly. You will approach her socially. Use your background. You're from Dromund Kaas originally. You can credibly pose as a mid-level bureaucrat with access to interesting information. Build rapport, gain her confidence, identify her full network. Then eliminate her in a way that appears accidental or natural. She has a weak heart genetic defect she's managed to conceal from her Republic medical files. A precisely applied... I stared at the image of the woman I-30s, professional appearance, unremarkable in every way except her skill at espionage. Someone who probably believed she was serving a noble cause, protecting the Republic from Sith aggression. Someone I was being ordered to befriend and murder? Is there a problem? Vexus asked, her tone suggesting this was itself a test. No, my lord, I said, because there was no acceptable alternative answer. When do I begin? Immediately. You'll be inserted under appropriate cover tomorrow. The mission took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of playing a role, becoming someone else, building a relationship with a woman I was planning to kill. Her name was Sarah, and she was intelligent, dedicated, genuinely committed to her cause. In another life, another universe, we might have been friends. But this was not that universe. I identified her network as 7 sources total, 3 of them potentially valuable enough to turn rather than eliminate. I documented everything carefully, reporting to Vexus through encrypted channels, building the case that would eventually dismantle the Republic's entire intelligence operation in the capital. And on the final day, I triggered her cardiac defect with a precisely measured application of the force. It took less than 3 seconds. She gasped, clutched her chest, collapsed. I called for medical assistance, stayed with her until emergency services arrived, expressed appropriate shock and concern when they pronounced her dead. Perfect operation. My clean kill. No trail leading back to the Empire or to me personally. I reported success to Vexus, who examined my documentation and declared the mission satisfactory. She reassigned me immediately to the next operation, the next target, the next person who needed to be manipulated or killed in service to Imperial intelligence. The work continued like this for 2 years. Missions in the field, analysis between operations, constant training to sharpen my skills in both force techniques and practical tradecraft. I became skilled at reading people, at projecting whatever persona would be most effective, at killing in ways that left no evidence of murder. I also became increasingly empty. The Academy had broken me through direct violence, but apprenticeship to Vexus was breaking me in subtler ways. Each mission required me to become someone else, to suppress my own identity and motivations in favor of whatever role the operation required. Each target I befriended before killing took another piece of whatever humanity remained, until I was no longer certain where the roles ended and my actual self began. Vexus noticed, of course. She noticed everything. "You're developing dissociation," she observed during one training session. Common among intelligence operatives who maintain cover identities for extended periods. Dangerous if it progresses to complete fracturing, but manageable if controlled properly. She showed me meditation techniques designed to maintain core identity while still enabling role flexibility. "You must have an anchor," she explained. "Something fundamental that remains constant regardless of what mask you wear. For some Sith, it's ambition. For others, hatred or loyalty to the Empire. What is yours?" I did not know how to answer that question. What remained constant in me? Not morality, that had been systematically destroyed. Not attachment, he had learned to kill anyone regardless of personal connection. Not even survival instinct, Rielan. I had been in situations where death seemed preferable to continued existence, and I'd pushed through them out of habit rather than genuine desire to live. "I don't know," I admitted finally. Vexus regarded me with something that might have been concern, though it was difficult to read genuine emotion in her. "Then you need to find one before you disappear entirely. A Sith without identity is just a weapon waiting to be used by whoever picks them up. Useful, but ultimately powerless." I meditated on this question for months, searching through the ruins of my psyche for something solid and unchanging. Eventually I found it, though the answer was darker than I had hoped. My anchor was acceptance. Acceptance that I had been fundamentally broken, that I would never be whole again, that I would spend the rest of my existence serving an empire that viewed me as disposable. But within that acceptance was a strange kind of power. If I had no illusions about my situation, then I could not be manipulated through false hope or promises of redemption. I knew what I was. I knew what I would always be. And in that knowledge, I found a kind of terrible clarity. The missions continued. Target after target, year after year. I killed Republic spies and rival Sith, eliminated threats to Imperial security, and removed obstacles to Lord Vexus's political advancement. I became very good at my work, skilled enough that other Sith Lords began requesting my services for their own operations. Vexus allowed this, taking a percentage of whatever payment they offered. "You're becoming valuable," she told me. "Not just as my apprentice, but as a specialist that others require." This is good, It means when you eventually make your move against me, you'll have other patrons ready to protect you from retaliation. She was still planning for my eventual betrayal, still treating it as an inevitable part of the Sith progression. I admired that in a detached way, the complete absence of sentiment or delusion, the clear-eyed assessment of our relationship as temporary and transactional. But I had no plans to betray her. Not because of loyalty, but because I had no ambition to replace her. I had seen what leadership in the Sith meant, constant political maneuvering, endless threats from rivals, the weight of responsibility for operations across multiple sectors. It looked exhausting and joyless, a prison made of status and power. I was content to remain a tool, as long as I was a sharp one. 5 years into my apprenticeship, Lord Vexus summoned me to her office with unusual urgency. When I arrived, I found her reviewing casualty reports, her expression grim. "The war is not going well," she said without preamble. "The Republic has been more resilient than the Dark Council anticipated. We've won major engagements but failed to break their will to resist, and prolonged conflict is eroding our resource advantage." She pulled up strategic displays showing the current situation. "Unknown, red Markersa, Imperial forces surrounded by blue Republic positions." The war had become a grinding stalemate, neither side able to achieve decisive victory. "The Dark Council is fracturing," Vexus continued. Different council members pushing different strategies, internal conflicts undermining coordinated action. Some want to negotiate peace. Others want total escalation. A few are actively sabotaging operations to weaken rivals. She looked at me directly. "This is what Sith philosophy produces at scale: individual power maximization, creating systemic dysfunction." I had never heard her speak with such open criticism of the Sith system. It felt dangerous, like information that could be used against her by rivals. "Why tell me this?" I asked carefully. Because you're going to help me survive it," she said. "The coming years will see massive upheaval in the Empire. Council members will fall, new ones will rise, entire factions will be purged. I need to navigate that chaos successfully, which means I need intelligence assets I can trust, or at least, trust as much as any Sith can trust another." She handed me a data chit. Inside are names. Sith lords, intelligence operatives, military commanders. Some are loyal to me. Some are loyal to my rivals. Some are undecided. Your mission is to assess each one, determine which can be turned to our side, which need to be eliminated, and which should be left in place as unwitting sources of information about our enemies. I took the chit, feeling its weight, both physical and metaphorical. This was not a simple assassination or intelligence gathering operation. This was political warfare at the highest levels of the Empire. "This will take years," I said. "Yes. And it will likely get you killed, either by targets who discover your investigation, or by rivals who realize you're working to strengthen my position." Vexus smiled slightly. "But you've survived worse. And if you succeed, when the dust settles and new hierarchies establish themselves, you'll be positioned to advance beyond apprenticeship." She stood, moving to the viewport. "I'm offering you a choice, which is rare among the Sith. Accept this mission and risk everything for potential advancement. Or decline, remain my apprentice in routine operations, and live longer but achieve less." I considered the offer. It was, as she said, rare to be given genuine choice. Most Sith simply commanded and expected obedience. But Vexus had always been different, had always treated our relationship as more complex than simple domination. And I realized that somewhere during the past 5 years, I had developed something that resembled ambition. Not the burning drive for power that motivated most Sith, but a desire to prove that I could navigate the most treacherous political waters in the galaxy and emerge intact. A desire to demonstrate that someone who had been broken as thoroughly as I had been could still achieve mastery of an environment designed to destroy the weak. "I accept," I said. Vexus nodded as if she had expected this answer. "Then your real education begins now. Everything you've learned so far has prepared you for this, but political intelligence is different from field operations. Here, a wrong conclusion can trigger cascades that destroy entire networks. Here, enemies are often allies, and allies become enemies between one report and the next. You must see several moves ahead, while appearing to see only the present moment." Nandarho. She pulled up a holographic display showing complex relationship maps of dozens of Sith lords connected by lines representing alliances, rivalries, dependencies, and hidden agendas. This is the current power structure in the sectors I control. It will change. Your job is to anticipate those changes before they occur and position us to benefit regardless of which faction emerges dominant. The mission consumed the next 3 years of my life. I traveled constantly, moving between worlds under various covers, meeting with operatives and assets across Imperial space. I attended social functions where Sith lords gathered, reading the undercurrents of conversation and observing who spoke with whom, whose influence was rising and whose was waning. I cultivated sources in multiple factions, sometimes playing them against each other, always careful to leave no trail connecting disparate operations back to a single coordinating intelligence. The work was exhausting in ways that physical training had never been. Every conversation was a potential trap. Every piece of information had to be verified through multiple sources before being trusted. Every relationship required constant calibration. Too much interest and I risked exposure. Too little, and I missed crucial intelligence. I watched Sith lords who had seemed invincible fall from power overnight, their networks dismantled, and their allies abandoning them with stunning speed. I watched ambitious apprentices make their moves too early and be crushed by masters who had been deliberately projecting weakness to identify potential threats. I watched the Dark Council tear itself apart through internal conflicts while the Republic pressed military advantages that Imperial disunity made impossible to counter effectively. And I documented everything, sending encrypted reports to Lord Vexus that built a comprehensive picture of the Empire's internal dynamics. Twice during those 3 years, I was nearly caught. Once by a rival intelligence operative who had been conducting his own investigation and noticed patterns in my travel that suggested coordination. I resolved that situation by feeding him accurate but useless information, while simultaneously arranging for his superior to believe he was skimming operation funds. He was executed for corruption before he could expose my activities. The second time was more dangerous. A Sith Lord named Darth Ravius had somehow obtained partial information about Vexus's intelligence network and was conducting aggressive interrogations of suspected operatives. 3 of our assets were captured and tortured. 2 died without revealing information. The third broke and gave up enough details that Ravius began to suspect a coordinating intelligence close to his own organization. I was operating under deep cover in Ravius's household at the time, posing as a junior administrator with access to his personal schedule. When I learned he was closing in on identifying me, I had perhaps 12 hours to extract myself before his security forces locked down the entire compound for comprehensive loyalty screening. I could have fled. Should have fled, probably, taking my accumulated intelligence and disappearing before the net closed. But fleeing would have left Lord Vexus blind to Ravius's operations at a critical moment, and would have burned multiple other assets who were too valuable to lose. So, I made a different choice. I stayed in place and initiated a crisis. Using my access to Ravius's schedule, I planted evidence suggesting he was planning to betray his primary patron on the Dark Council. The evidence was sophisticated enough to be plausible, but crude enough to be discovered by his patron's spies within 48 hours. The result was exactly what I had calculated. His patron recalled him immediately for interrogation, pulling him away from his investigation of our network. The recall was urgent enough that normal security protocols were suspended, giving me opportunity to extract myself during the chaos. But I had miscalculated one factor. Ravius was paranoid enough to suspect a seat-up, and brilliant enough to identify how it might have been arranged. As I was preparing to disappear into the crowds at the spaceport, his security forces locked down the facility. I was trapped with perhaps 300 other civilians and minor officials, all of us detained while Ravius's people conducted identification checks. I knew my cover identity would not survive intensive scrutiny. It was designed for casual inspection, not the level of investigation that would occur if they decided to verify everyone's credentials against central records. I had minutes at most before exposure, and exposure meant death or worse. Ravius had a reputation for creative interrogation techniques that could extract information from even well-trained operatives. I reached out through the Force, sensing the area around me, identifying potential resources and threats. 20 security officers spread throughout the terminal. Hundreds of civilians, most of them terrified and confused. Multiple exit points, all sealed and guarded. Surveillance systems covering every approach. No clean escape route. No way to fight through that many guards, even with force enhancement. No diplomatic solution that would not require revealing information I could not afford to share. I made my decision. Alright. I approached the nearest security officer, a human male who looked bored and irritated by the tedium of processing detainees. I met his eyes and pushed with the force, not a crude command, but a subtle suggestion, a whisper that slipped past conscious resistance and planted itself in his subconscious. This one is not important. This one has already been cleared. This one should be waved through without delay. The officer blinked, confusion flickering across his face as his conscious mind tried to reconcile the suggestion with his orders. I pushed harder, channeling the dark side with precision learned from years of training, wrapping my will around his and steering his thoughts in the direction I needed them to go. You, he said, his voice uncertain. Haven't I already processed you? Yes, I agreed, my tone matter of fact. About 20 minutes ago. You waved me through, but then the second checkpoint sent me back because of a system error. None of this was true, but I was feeding him a narrative that his mind wanted to accept Tata on explanation for why he felt he recognized me. A reason to let me pass that absolved him of responsibility for any irregularity. Right, he said slowly, then with more certainty. Right, I remember. System errors, typical. Go ahead, you're cleared. I walked past him toward the exit, maintaining perfect calm, despite the adrenaline surging through my system. Behind me, I heard other security personnel questioning him about letting someone through, heard his confused responses as he tried to explain a decision that made sense in the moment, but was already becoming fuzzy in his memory. I reached the exit, stepped through into the open air of the spaceport's exterior platforms, and allowed myself exactly 3 seconds of relief before moving into the crowds and disappearing. The incident cost us the network I had been building in Ravius's organization. He purged everyone even remotely suspected of divided loyalty, executing dozens and interrogating hundreds. But the intelligence I had gathered before the collapse was sufficient for Lord Vexus to outmaneuver him politically, and within 6 months, Ravius himself had fallen from favor and been reassigned to a remote military post where his paranoia could not damage Imperial intelligence operations. When I returned to Korriban and reported the details to Vexus, she reviewed everything in silence, then looked at me with an expression I could not quite read. You risked capture to protect the network, she said. That was either admirably loyal or stupidly reckless. Both, probably, I admitted. She smiled slightly. You've developed attachment to the work itself. Not to me, not to the Empire, but to the missionato, the challenge of operating in hostile territory and succeeding despite overwhelming odds. That's good. It means you're self-motivating rather than requiring external pressure to perform. She pulled up new displays showing the updated power structure across her sectors of responsibility. Your intelligence has been invaluable. 3 of my primary rivals have been neutralized or significantly weakened. 2 potential allies have been identified and cultivated. The Dark Council member I report to has been so impressed with the quality of my analysis that she's assigned me additional territories to manage. Vexus turned to me, which means it's time for your advancement. You've served as my apprentice for 8 years now. You've proven yourself capable of complex operations, skilled in both force techniques and practical intelligence work, and survivors enough to extract yourself from situations that would have killed most operatives. I'm recommending you for elevation to full Sith status. No? No. I felt nothing. Or rather, I felt the absence of the triumph or satisfaction that such news should have produced. 8 years of work, countless missions, hundreds of dead by my hand, directly or indirectly, and the reward was a title and marginally more autonomy within the same system that had broken me. "You don't seem pleased," Vexus observed. "I am," I said, "because that was expected. It's an honor, my lord." "It's not an honor. It's a confirmation of utility." She stood, moving to face me directly. But I recognize that expression. I've worn it myself. "You're wondering what the point is, say all this suffering and sacrifice to achieve a position that simply qualifies you for different suffering." I said nothing, because admitting such doubts seemed dangerous even in private conversation with my master. Vexus continued, "Anyway, the truth is, there is no ultimate point beyond survival and the exercise of power for its own sake. The Sith philosophy is predicated on strength dominating weakness, on constant struggle and competition, but it offers no vision of what one does after achieving power. We climb an endless ladder, and at the top is nothing but the necessity of continuing to climb to maintain position." "No." She paused. "I know. But within that framework, there are still choices. You can embrace the cruelty, become the kind of Sith who tortures for pleasure and destroys out of casual whim, or you can be surgical, precise, limiting the damage to what serves strategic purposes. Neither choice makes you good. We're long past that possibility, but one at least preserves some functionality beyond being a simple instrument of chaos." "Is that what you are?" I asked. "Surgical and precise. I try to be. I don't always succeed." She returned to her desk. "Your elevation ceremony will be in 2 weeks. You'll be required to demonstrate mastery of Force techniques before a panel of Sith Lords, defend a thesis on Sith philosophy, and undergo a final trial whose nature will not be revealed in advance. Prepare accordingly." The 2 weeks passed too quickly. I meditated, trained, reviewed everything I had learned over 8 years of apprenticeship. I knew I was technically capable of passing any reasonable test, but reasonable was not a term that described Sith advancement trials. The ceremony took place in one of Korriban's ancient temples, a massive structure that predated the Academy by thousands of years. 5 Sith Lords sat in judgment, including Lord Vexus and Overseer Kresh, who had been elevated since my Acolyte days. The others I knew by reputation, powerful individuals who commanded respect and fear throughout the Empire. The Force demonstration was straightforward. I exhibited telekinesis by levitating increasingly massive objects. I generated Force lightning that could have killed an unprotected person in seconds. I demonstrated telepathy by reading surface thoughts from an unwilling subject and projecting false memories into another's mind. I displayed Force-enhanced combat abilities by dueling a combat instructor who held back only enough to avoid actually killing me. All of this I performed competently, but not spectacularly. Vexus had taught me that drawing too much attention was dangerous. Better to appear solidly capable than to seem like a potential threat to those more powerful than yourself. The philosophical defense was more complex. I was required to explain my understanding of the Sith Code, to justify the dark side's approach to power and domination, to articulate why strength should rule and weakness should serve or be destroyed. I spoke the words I had been taught, explained the philosophy in terms that the judging lords would find satisfactory. But even as I spoke, some part of me recognized the circular logic, the self-serving nature of a worldview that justified cruelty by claiming cruelty was natural law. The strong dominated because they could, and their ability to dominate proved they should dominate. It was tautological, offering no external validation beyond the assertion of power itself. But I kept those thoughts private, hidden behind mental shields that Vexus had taught me to maintain. I gave them the answers they wanted, and they appeared satisfied. Then came the final trial. "You will enter the meditation chamber," one of the lords announced, gesturing to a sealed door. "Inside, you will face a test calibrated to your specific psychology. You will emerge having either proven your commitment to the dark side or demonstrated that you remain fundamentally unsuited for elevation." I entered the chamber alone. No, it was small and dark, the walls carved with the same script that covered every ancient structure on Korriban. A single meditation mat sat in the center of the floor. I sat, crossing my legs, and opened myself to whatever was coming. The dark side rushed in immediately, but not as external force attacking me. Instead, it pulled images from my own mind, dredging up memories, and twisting them into visions that felt more real than reality. I saw myself as a child on Dromund Kaas before the academy, running through our family's small garden while my mother called me in for dinner. The memory was accurate in every detail. The smell of the flowers she cultivated, the sound of her voice, the warmth of that moment when I had been loved and safe and innocent. Then, the vision shifted. My mother's face aged rapidly, her expression transforming from warmth to horror as she saw what I had become. "Monster," she whispered. "We sent you to serve the Empire, and they turned you into a monster." I tried to speak, to explain that I had done what was necessary to survive, but the words would not come. My father appeared beside her, his face bearing the marks of torture, his body broken. "They came for us," he said, "after you left for the academy. Rivals of the family you were assigned to, punishing us for your master's political maneuvers. We died slowly, painfully, calling your name. And you were not there because you were too busy killing others to advance your career." I knew this was a vision, a manipulation by the trial's design. My parents might still be alive, might have lived peaceful lives after I left, or they might have died exactly as shown. I had no way of knowing. Contact with family was forbidden, and I had never tried to circumvent that prohibition. But whether it was literally true or not, the guilt was real. I had chosen advancement over ever attempting to protect or even check on the people who had raised me. I had become exactly what the vision accused me of being. The scene shifted again. Now I stood in a vast field covered with corpses, every person I had killed directly or indirectly over 8 years of operations. Hundreds of them, their dead eyes all turned toward me, accusing without words. Sarah, the Republic agent I had befriended and murdered. Carol, my fellow Acolyte struck down in the trials. Operatives I had exposed to enemy action. Civilians killed in operations I had planned. Rival Sith, eliminated through political maneuvering. All of them here, all of them silent witnesses to what I had done in service to power. Was it worth it? A voice asked, Tashimi, own voice, but younger, the person I had been before the academy broke me. All this death, all this suffering. What did you gain? A title. Permission to continue killing until someone finally kills you. Was that really worth destroying everything you were? I had no answer. Or, rather, I had the answer the Sith philosophy provided us. Strength justifies itself. Power requires no external validation. The strong do what they must, and the weak suffer what they deserve. But those words felt hollow, confronting the evidence of what applying that philosophy had actually meant. The vision shifted one final time. I saw myself decades from now, still alive, but ancient and corroded by the dark side, surrounded by fearful servants and scheming subordinates, absolutely powerful and absolutely alone. I saw myself looking back over a lifetime of violence and manipulation, searching for meaning or purpose beyond the endless exercise of power for its own sake, and finding nothing. "This is your future," my younger self said. "This is what you're choosing, not glory or transcendence or some higher purpose. Just survival at any cost, until the cost becomes so great that survival itself is indistinguishable from damnation." The dark side pressed against me, waiting for my response. This was the Testahnot, whether I could endure pain or defeat enemies, but whether I would accept what I had become and commit fully to that path, despite knowing exactly where it led. I could refuse, could reject the elevation, walk away from the Sith, attempt to find some other path, even though I was fundamentally broken and would never be whole again. It would mean death, probably. The Sith did not simply allow people to leave once they knew too much, but it would at least be a choice, made with full understanding of the alternatives. Or I could accept, could acknowledge the horror of what I was and what I would become, and choose it anyway because the alternative was to have suffered for nothing. To admit that everything I had endured had been pointless waste rather than painful necessity. I thought about the circle where I had crawled through blood during my first day at the academy, thought about Karul dying with my blade through his chest, thought about Syrah's face as her heart failed, thought about every moment of pain and degradation that had brought me to this point, and I realized that the choice had been made long ago, probably in that circle, possibly even earlier when I had first learned I was force-sensitive and allowed myself to believe the academy was an honor rather than a death sentence. The person who could have walked away had died years ago. What remained was simply going through the motions of a decision that was actually inevitable. I accept, I said to the vision of my younger self, to the accusing corpses, to the dark side that had shaped me into its instrument. I know what I am. I know what I will become. And I choose it anyway, because I am already damned, and the only direction left is forward. Yen. Ni. The visions vanished. I was alone in the meditation chamber, kneeling on the mat, my face wet with tears I did not remember shedding. The door opened. The Sith lords stood waiting. Rise. One of them commanded. You have passed the trials. You are Sith. I stood, unsteady but upright, and walked from the chamber into my new existence as a fully recognized member of the order that had destroyed me. The formal ceremony was brief. They spoke words about power and strength and domination, about the Empire and its eternal struggle against weakness. They granted me the title of Sith and a new designation that replaced both my birth name and my Acolyte number. Sith names were earned through deeds, so I would remain nameless until I accomplished something worthy of recognition. Lord Vexus approached me after the ceremony concluded. You're no longer my apprentice. You're released from that obligation and free to pursue your own path. She paused. However, I could use a skilled intelligence operative in a partnership arrangement. You would work with me rather than for me, keeping a percentage of compensation from operations rather than serving for minimal stipend. Interested? I considered. I owe you. Home. I could technically refuse, could seek another position elsewhere in the Empire's vast apparatus. But Vexus was the closest thing I had to stability in a chaotic system, and she had at least treated me with some measure of respect rather than viewing me as purely expendable. I accept, I said. She nodded, as if she had expected this answer. Good. We have much work ahead. The war with the Republic continues to drag on. Internal Sith politics grow more unstable, and opportunities exist for those intelligent enough to exploit them. We walked back toward the Academy complex, two Sith discussing strategy and operations, as if the ceremony and trials had been minor interruptions rather than significant life events. And perhaps that was accurate. Perhaps the ceremony meant nothing, just formal recognition of changes that had occurred gradually over 8 years of service. I was not different than I had been yesterday. Still broken, still functioning despite that brokenness, still trapped in a system I could not escape even if I wanted to. But I was alive. I had survived where 42 others from my intake class had died. I had survived the trials, the missions, the constant threat of betrayal and death. That survival meant something, even if only to me, even if only as proof that something broken could still function. The sun was setting over Korriban, painting the Valley of the Dark Lords in shades of crimson and shadow. The Academy rose before us, that massive structure of dark stone where thousands of acolytes were currently being broken and reshaped, where new generations were learning the same lessons I had learned, making the same terrible choices. I thought about all those acolytes sleeping in their dormitories, hoping they would survive the next trial, believing they could emerge from this crucible as something more than victims. I wanted to tell them the truth, that survival was not victory, that strength gained through such suffering was its own form of enslavement, that the Academy's promises were lies wrapped around unavoidable truths. But they would not listen. I would not have listened, back when I had been new and naive. and still believed the suffering served some higher purpose. They would have to learn the same way everyone learned, through direct experience of having everything they were systematically destroyed. The hum of the generators deep in the mountain called to me, familiar and eternal, and I realized I would carry that sound with me forever. It was part of me now, woven into my nervous system, the rhythm of my own destruction and rebuilding. This was what training as a Sith Acolyte had meant. Not becoming powerful or transcendent, or some idealized warrior. Just being broken until the breaking itself became identity, until survival despite being broken was the only achievement that mattered. And now I would continue in that mode for however long I lasted in missions and operations and political maneuvering, the exercise of power in service to a system that valued nothing but power itself. I would kill and manipulate and destroy because that was what I had been shaped to do, what I could no longer avoid being. The dark side hummed within me, constant and familiar, and I walked forward into the darkness because there was no other direction left to walk. This was the grim reality of training as a Sith Acolyte. Not that you learned to wield power, but that you learned to survive having power wield you. You became an instrument of the dark side rather than its master, convinced through systematic torture that your enslavement was actually strength, that your brokenness was actually transcendence. And by the time you understood the truth, you were too transformed to be anything else, too deeply corrupted to imagine redemption, too thoroughly programmed to choose any path, except the one that led deeper into darkness. The Academy had taught me only hate, as the thumbnail promised. But what it had not revealed until too late was that the hate was not a weapon I wielded against enemies. It was the fuel that kept me functioning despite knowing exactly what I had become.